some debts aren't paid in dollars. They're paid in karma. And tonight's story is about a debt that took 6 months to collect. I want you to picture something with me. A corner office on the 14th floor of a glass tower in Meridian City. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. A mahogany desk that cost more than most people's cars, now cluttered with the remnants of a career being dismantled piece by piece. And behind that desk, a man named David Harrington, packing his belongings into a cardboard box while 2 security guards watched from the doorway. It was a Tuesday afternoon in November, the kind of gray, drizzly day where the clouds hang so low they seem to press down on the city itself. Meridian City looked washed out through those floor-to-ceiling windows, the skyscrapers fading into mist, the streets below glistening with rain that had been falling since dawn. The smell of wet pavement drifted up from 14 stories below, mixing with the recycled air of the climate-controlled office. David's hands were shaking as he placed a framed photo into the box. The photo showed him shaking hands with the CEO, both men grinning at the camera like they'd just conquered something together. The photo was from 18 months earlier, when David had been promoted to department head, when he'd been untouchable, when the future had seemed like an endless upward trajectory. Now that future was a cardboard box and a security escort. His executive chair, the one with the Italian leather and the ergonomic lumbar support, the one he'd specifically requested when he took this office, sat empty behind him. Someone else would be sitting in it by Friday. Someone who hadn't spent the last 6 months systematically burning every bridge they'd ever built. Through the glass walls of his office, David could see his former employees watching. The open floor plan that he'd once loved for the way it let him survey his domain now worked against him. There was nowhere to hide. Every eye on the floor could see the man who had once held their careers in his hands, now reduced to packing up desk trinkets under supervision. Some of his employees tried to look busy at their computers, their fingers moving but accomplishing nothing. Others weren't even pretending. They watched with expressions ranging from shock to confusion to satisfaction. A few were openly smiling, though they tried to hide it behind coffee cups and turned shoulders. And in the conference room across the floor, visible through another set of glass walls, sat a man named Jordan Mitchell. The same man David had fired 6 months earlier, the same man he'd escorted out of this very building with security, calling him a performance issue and a liability to anyone who would listen. Jordan was in that conference room now, meeting with 3 of the company's biggest clients. Clients who had left Hartwell and Associates when Jordan left. Clients who had specifically demanded his involvement when they'd agreed to return their business to the firm. Clients who had made it very clear, in formal letters and pointed phone calls, they worked with Jordan Mitchell or they didn't work with Hartwell and Associates at all. David caught Jordan's eye through the glass. For just a moment, across that open floor, their gazes locked. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Someone's phone rang in the distance. The rain continued to streak down the windows. David's face was pale, drawn, defeated. The confident swagger that had defined him for 18 months had evaporated. His shoulders, usually thrown back in a power pose he'd probably learned from a management seminar, were slumped forward. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. Jordan's expression was calm, not gloating, not triumphant, not even satisfied exactly, just calm. The kind of calm that comes from knowing that justice, real justice, doesn't require you to lift a finger. Sometimes you just have to wait for it to arrive on its own schedule. Jordan gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible, and then turned back to his clients as if David Harrington didn't exist, as if he'd never existed at all. That's where this story ends. But to understand what that moment meant, to really feel what karma collected that day, and how the ledger finally balanced, we need to go back to the beginning, back to before David Harrington ever became Jordan's boss, back to when Jordan was just a young man trying to build something meaningful out of his career and his life. If this sounds like a story you need to hear, if you've ever dealt with a toxic boss, workplace politics, with a kind of betrayal that makes you question everything you thought you knew about fairness and hard work, hit that subscribe button right now, like this video, and settle in, because this one goes deep. I'm going to tell you everything, every detail, every lesson, every moment where karma was quietly taking notes in that ledger it keeps hidden from view. The old saying goes, what you do in the dark eventually comes to light. David Harrington is about to learn exactly how true that is. Let me introduce you to Jordan Mitchell. He was 34 years old when this story reached its climax, but he'd been building toward it his entire life without knowing it. Every value he held, every instinct he trusted, every relationship he cultivated, all of it would matter before this was over. Jordan grew up in a small town called Millbrook, about an hour outside of Meridian City. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and your reputation followed you from kindergarten to your grave, where you couldn't buy groceries without running into your elementary school teacher, and where news traveled faster than the internet could ever manage. Population 3,000 and change. One main street with a diner, a hardware store, a barber shop that had been run by the same family for 4 generations, the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked and waved at passing cars whether they recognized the driver or not. His father, Marcus Mitchell, had worked at the same manufacturing plant for 32 years. 32 years of waking up before dawn, packing his lunch the night before, driving the same route in the same truck to the same parking spot. 32 years of showing up early, staying late when needed, and doing his job with a quiet dignity that Jordan only fully appreciated as an adult. Marcus was a line supervisor by the time Jordan was in high school, not because he'd climbed aggressively, not because he'd played politics or kissed up to management, but because the company simply couldn't ignore his competence anymore. He managed his team the same way he managed everything, with patience, fairness, and an absolute intolerance for excuses. Jordan remembered sitting on the back porch with his father on summer evenings, watching the fireflies blink in the yard while Marcus nursed a single beer after dinner. "You show up, you do the work, you treat people right," Marcus used to say, his calloused hands wrapped around the bottle. "Everything else is just noise." Marcus never complained about his work, never brought the stress home, never raised his voice at Evelyn or Jordan, even on the hardest days. He never called in sick unless he was truly incapacitated. And even then, Jordan remembered his mother practically forcing him to stay in bed during a bout of flu when Jordan was 12. His father had wanted to go in anyway, didn't want to let his team down. He believed, with a sincerity that seems almost quaint in today's cynical world, that if you worked hard and treated people fairly, good things would follow. That the world, on balance, rewarded integrity, that character mattered more than cleverness. Jordan's mother, Evelyn, was a school teacher, 4th grade. She had the kind of patience that allowed her to explain the same math concept 15 different ways until every student in her classroom understood it. She stayed late to tutor struggling readers. She bought supplies with her own money when the school budget ran short. She attended every recital, every game, every parent-teacher conference for kids whose own parents couldn't be bothered. The Mitchell house was always full of books. Shelves in every room, stacked on nightstands, piled by the reading chair where Evelyn spent her evenings. She believed that education was the great equalizer, that a kid from Millbrook could go anywhere, do anything, if they were willing to learn. Evelyn taught Jordan that knowledge was the one thing no one could ever take from you, and that the smartest person in the room wasn't always the one with the answers, but often the one asking the right questions. "Listen more than you talk," she'd tell him, tucking him in at night when he was young, the smell of her lavender hand cream mixing with the fresh sheets. "And when you do talk, make sure it's worth hearing." Growing up, Jordan was neither the smartest kid in his class nor the most athletic. He was somewhere in the comfortable middle in both categories. Good enough to not stand out for struggling, not exceptional enough to stand out for excelling. But Jordan was the most kid anyone knew. When he didn't understand something in school, he stayed after class until he did. He'd sit at his teacher's desk, notebook open, asking question after question until the concept finally clicked. Some teachers found this annoying. The good ones recognized it as something valuable. A refusal to accept confusion, a determination to actually understand rather than just memorize and move on. Mrs. Patterson, his 7th grade math teacher, once told his parents at a conference, "Jordan isn't the quickest student I've ever had, but he might be the most determined. That boy does not give up." When Jordan was 14, he decided he wanted to make the basketball team. He wasn't tall, 5'7" at the time, still waiting for a growth spurt that would eventually bring him to 5'10". He wasn't particularly coordinated. The first time he tried out for the middle school team, he was cut after the second day of tryouts. Most kids would have accepted that verdict and moved on to something else. Maybe tried out for the chess club or the school paper. But Jordan didn't. He practiced for 2 hours every night that entire summer. The old hoop his father had mounted above the garage door became his obsession. He dribbled until his hands were raw and blistered, then kept dribbling. He shot free throws until his shoulders ached, then shot 50 more. He ran drills he'd seen on TV, making up variations when he ran out of official ones to copy. His father would sometimes come out and watch from the lawn chair, not saying much, just nodding occasionally when Jordan made a difficult shot. That silent approval meant more to Jordan than any trophy. He didn't make varsity until junior year, but he made it. 3rd string, mostly riding the bench, but he earned that spot on the roster. And by senior year, he was starting. Not because he'd become the tallest or the most naturally talented, because he'd become the most disciplined, the one who never gave up. That persistence carried him to State University's business school, where he graduated near the top of his class despite working 2 campus jobs to pay his tuition. His father had offered to help with costs, but Jordan had seen the numbers. He knew what that help would mean for his parents' retirement savings. They'd worked too hard for too long. He politely declined and worked nights at the campus library and weekends at a local restaurant instead. His grades suffered slightly for it. He graduated 4th in his class instead of 1st. But he graduated debt-free and with a work ethic that couldn't be taught in any classroom. That work ethic carried him through his first years in the workforce, when he was just another junior analyst grinding through spreadsheets at a mid-tier consulting firm in Meridian City. Long hours, low pay, a cubicle so small he could touch both walls if he stretched out his arms. The fluorescent lights gave him headaches, and the coffee was always stale. But Jordan didn't complain. He learned the business piece by piece, watched the consultants above him closely, figured out what worked and what didn't, asked questions constantly, not to show off, but because he genuinely wanted to understand. His supervisor once told him he asked more questions than any analyst they'd ever hired. Jordan took it as a compliment, and eventually that persistence carried him to Hartwell and Associates, where at 27 years old, he was hired as a business development associate and told by his interviewer that he had potential. 7 years later, that potential had crystallized into something formidable. Jordan had risen through the ranks to become a senior consultant and one of the firm's top performers. His client retention rate was 93%, significantly higher than the company average of 71%. The accounts he managed generated nearly $8 million in annual revenue. He'd built a team of 6 analysts and associates who, to a person, would have followed him anywhere. But more than the numbers, more than the metrics that showed up on quarterly reports and annual reviews, Jordan had something that couldn't be measured on a spreadsheet: relationships. He remembered the names of his clients' children, not because he kept notes in a CRM system, though he did keep notes, but because he actually listened when people talked about their lives. He knew which executives preferred phone calls to emails and which ones never answered the phone after 5 p.m. He knew who was going through a divorce and needed extra patience, who had just become a grandparent and liked to show photos, who was dealing with a sick parent and might need to reschedule meetings on short notice. He sent birthday cards, real ones, handwritten, not auto-generated from a marketing platform. He remembered anniversaries, work anniversaries, wedding anniversaries, the anniversary of when a client's business first turned profitable. He showed up. He showed up to quarterly review meetings with specific questions about challenges the client had mentioned in passing 3 months earlier. "How did that inventory issue resolve?" he'd ask, or, "Did your daughter end up getting into that school?" These weren't manipulation tactics. Jordan genuinely cared. He'd been raised to care. He made people feel heard, respected, and valued. In a business where clients were often treated as revenue streams rather than human beings, Jordan treated them as human beings first. The revenue followed naturally. In a business built on trust, Jordan Mitchell was trusted, completely, implicitly, by everyone who worked with him. His personal life, though quieter than his professional achievements, was equally fulfilling. He'd married his college sweetheart, Amelia Foster, who now went by Amelia Mitchell. They'd met sophomore year in a 20th century literature class that neither of them had initially wanted to take. Jordan needed the humanities credit for his business degree. Amelia was an English major who'd accidentally enrolled in the wrong section and couldn't switch out. They sat next to each other on the first day. Jordan had said something awkward about Fitzgerald being overrated. Amelia had laughed. By the end of the semester, they were inseparable. Amelia worked as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation center downtown, the kind of work that required as much emotional labor as physical knowledge. She helped stroke patients relearn how to walk, celebrating with them when they took their first steps across the parallel bars. She guided athletes through the frustrating process of recovery, talking them through the mental challenges as much as the physical ones. She held hands with elderly patients who just wanted someone to listen to stories about their grandchildren. She and Jordan were well matched that way. Both of them drawn to work that mattered. Both of them committed to showing up, day after day, whether it was easy or hard. They understood each other's late nights and tired evenings. They had a 6-year-old daughter named Sophie, who had her mother's expressive brown eyes and her father's stubborn streak. Sophie was convinced she was going to be a veterinarian, a ballerina, and an astronaut, preferably all 3 simultaneously. She approached every obstacle with the same determination Jordan had shown on that basketball court years ago. When Sophie was learning to ride a bike, she fell off 17 times in one afternoon. Each time, she got back up, brushed off her knees, and tried again. Jordan had watched from the sidewalk with tears in his eyes, seeing himself in that little girl, seeing his father's lessons passed down to another generation. The Mitchells had bought a modest house in a nice neighborhood on the east side of Meridian City, the kind of place with good schools and block parties on the 4th of July. It wasn't the largest house, it wasn't in the fanciest neighborhood, but it was theirs. A place where Sophie could grow up safe and loved, where Amelia could tend her small garden on weekend mornings, where Jordan could fire up the grill for neighbors who'd become friends. Jordan didn't need to conquer the world. He just wanted to build a good life, do meaningful work, and leave things better than he found them. He had no idea that all of it, his career, his confidence, his sense of security, the reputation he'd spent 7 years building brick by brick, was about to come under attack from someone he'd never done a single thing to harm. Someone who saw Jordan's competence not as an asset to the team, but as a threat to his own carefully constructed image. The offices of Hartwell and Associates occupied floors 12 through 16 of the Nexus Tower in downtown Meridian City. It was the kind of building that made a statement before you even walked through the doors. Glass and steel and sharp angles, rising 50 stories above the street, catching the morning light in ways that made it appear to glow from within. The lobby was all marble and modern art, the kind of space designed to intimidate visitors into respecting whatever business happened inside. Security guards in navy blazers checked IDs at a curved reception desk. Elevators played soft classical music on the way up. The whole building smelled faintly of expensive cologne and ambition. The firm itself was a mid-sized consulting company that had carved out a respectable niche in business strategy and operations improvement. Not as prestigious as McKinsey or Bain, but not trying to be. Hartwell had built its reputation over 40 years on being practical, accessible, and reliable. They weren't selling flashy innovations or revolutionary disruption. They were selling results. Measurable, consistent, repeatable results. It was the kind of firm that attracted a certain type of employee. People who valued substance over flash, who preferred to let their work speak for itself. Who believed, perhaps naively, that competence would always be rewarded. Jordan's floor. The 14th housed the Client Services Department, home to about 40 consultants divided into smaller teams. The open floor plan was designed to encourage collaboration, clusters of desks separated by low partitions, meeting rooms with glass walls along the perimeter, and a small kitchen area where people gathered for coffee and conversation throughout the day. The culture, at least when Jordan had joined 7 years earlier, was genuinely good. Demanding but fair, high expectations balanced by real support. The kind of environment where you worked hard because you wanted to, because you felt invested in the outcomes, not because you were afraid of what would happen if you didn't. The previous department head, a woman named Patricia Chen, had understood that happy employees treated clients better. She'd been at Hartwell for 15 years, working her way up from consultant to manager to director to department head. She knew everyone's name. She remembered everyone's career goals. She pushed hard for results, but she pushed herself hardest of all. Under Patricia's leadership, Client Services had become one of the firm's most profitable divisions. Employee satisfaction scores were the highest in the company. Client retention exceeded industry averages. The 14th floor had a waiting list of internal transfers from people on other floors who wanted to work under Patricia's team. Then, 18 months before Jordan's firing, Patricia was promoted to the executive suite. She'd earned it after years of stellar performance and was brought in to oversee multiple departments from a newly created VP position. Her departure left a vacuum on the 14th floor, a leadership void that needed to be filled. And into that vacuum stepped David Harrington. But before I tell you about David, let me tell you about the people who worked alongside Jordan, because their stories matter too. When everything fell apart, these were the allies who would make the difference. And when karma came to collect, they would be witnesses to every moment. There was Maria Santos, Jordan's senior analyst and closest work friend. She was 31, whip-smart, with a sarcastic humor that could diffuse almost any tense situation. Maria had immigrated from Brazil with her family when she was 12, speaking almost no English. 20 years later, she spoke 4 languages fluently and had an MBA from one of the top programs in the country. Maria had been with Hartwell for 5 years, working her way up from an internship she'd started while finishing her MBA at night school. She'd been Jordan's first hire when he'd begun building his team, a decision he'd never regretted for a single day. She was fiercely protective of her team, and even more protective of her integrity. The kind of person who'd speak up in meetings when something was wrong, even when speaking up was unpopular, even when staying quiet would have been safer. Maria believed that truth had value, that honesty mattered, that you couldn't build anything real on a foundation of evasion and politics. That belief would be tested severely in the months ahead. Then there was Daniel Okafor, one of the junior associates on Jordan's team. 26 years old, fresh-faced, with an earnest enthusiasm that reminded Jordan of himself a decade earlier. Daniel had joined Hartwell straight out of his undergraduate program, eager to learn, desperate to prove himself. Daniel handled a lot of the detailed analysis work, spreadsheets, data pulls, research reports, and he was good at it, meticulous in a way that Jordan appreciated, the kind of employee who would stay an extra hour to triple-check his numbers before submitting a deliverable, even when no one asked him to. But Daniel was also inexperienced with office politics. He believed, as young people often do, that talent alone would be enough, that good work would be recognized and rewarded on its merits, that the workplace operated on logic and fairness. He would learn otherwise. The hard way. There was also Catherine Reyes, a mid-level consultant on a different team who had become a quiet ally of Jordan's over the years. Catherine was in her early 40s, divorced, raising 2 teenagers on her own while holding down one of the most demanding jobs in the department. She had no patience for nonsense, no tolerance for political games, and an almost supernatural ability to read people. Catherine had seen more corporate dysfunction than almost anyone else on the floor. Before Hartwell, she'd worked at 3 other consulting firms, each with its own variety of toxicity. She'd watched good people get pushed out. She'd watched mediocre people fail upward. She'd learned to recognize the patterns. When David Harrington arrived, Catherine saw the warning signs before anyone else. And she tried to warn Jordan, repeatedly, though he didn't fully listen until it was almost too late. And finally, there was Dr. Harold Brennan, Harry to anyone who knew him well. He was the head of internal training and development at Hartwell, a 63-year-old man who'd been with the firm almost since its founding in the 1980s. Silver-haired, bespectacled, with the gentle demeanor of a favorite professor. Harry had mentored 3 generations of Hartwell consultants. He'd taken Jordan under his wing during those first challenging years, teaching him not just the technical aspects of consulting, but the philosophical ones as well. How to build trust, how to listen, how to serve clients in ways that created genuine value rather than just billable hours. "This business is about trust," Harry would say, peering over his reading glasses in that way that made every word feel like wisdom being handed down. "Everything else is just arithmetic. Anyone can crunch numbers. Not everyone can earn the right to be believed." These were the people in Jordan's orbit. Good people, real people, the kind who showed up and did the work and tried to do it right. They would all, in different ways, be affected by what David Harrington was about to do. Now let me tell you about Jordan's clients, because understanding these relationships is critical to understanding what came later. These weren't just accounts on a balance sheet. They were people Jordan had come to know, respect, and genuinely care about. And that caring went both ways. The Morrison Technologies account was Jordan's crown jewel, a software development company that had grown from a scrappy startup to a mid-sized enterprise with 300 employees. Jordan had been their primary consultant for almost 5 years, surviving 3 different phone systems, 2 office relocations, and 1 near bankruptcy that they'd managed to pull through together. The CEO, Robert Morrison, was a soft-spoken engineer who had no patience for corporate speak, but appreciated people who delivered results. He wore the same style of plaid shirt every day, had about 20 identical ones in his closet, he'd once told Jordan, and drank exactly 4 cups of coffee before noon and none after. Robert and Jordan had developed something approaching friendship over those 5 years. The kind built on late-night strategy calls when crises emerged, on honest conversations about what was working and what wasn't, on the quiet trust that comes from keeping promises over and over again. When Robert's mother had passed away 2 years ago, Jordan had sent a handwritten note and made sure the team handled everything without bothering Robert for questions during his bereavement leave. When Jordan's daughter Sophie had her appendix out unexpectedly, Robert had sent a stuffed elephant to the hospital and told Jordan to take whatever time he needed. Business, yes, but also human. Whitfield Manufacturing was different. A family-owned industrial company that had been making precision parts for 60 years. The factory floor smelled like machine oil and metal shavings. The workers had been there for decades, many of them second and third generation. The company had weathered recessions and industry disruptions by refusing to compromise on quality, even when cutting corners would have been more profitable. The current CEO, Margaret Whitfield, was the 3rd generation to run the business. She was formal, proper, and valued tradition above almost everything else. She called Jordan Mr. Mitchell even after 3 years of working together and expected the same formality in return. She sent Christmas cards with handwritten notes and thanked people for their service in terms that sounded almost military. But beneath that formal exterior, Margaret was sharp as a blade. She'd spotted inefficiencies in Jordan's early proposals that Jordan himself had missed. She asked questions that cut right to the heart of assumptions. She valued competence above all else, and Jordan had proven his competence week after week, deliverable after deliverable, until she had come to trust his judgment implicitly. When Margaret trusted you, you stayed trusted. When she didn't, no amount of charm could save you. David Harrington would learn this the hard way. Then there was the Ventura Group, a collection of hospitality businesses, including 3 boutique hotels and 2 upscale restaurants scattered across the city. The managing partner, James Ventura, was flamboyant where Morrison was reserved. He wore custom suits in bold colors and gold cufflinks shaped like tiny lions. He spoke at twice the volume of normal conversation and laughed the same way he did everything else, loudly, completely, holding nothing back. Margaret Whitfield would have found him exhausting. Robert Morrison would have politely excused himself after 15 minutes. But James Ventura was also fiercely loyal to people he considered his people. Once you earned your way into that inner circle, he would go to war for you without hesitation. Jordan had helped the Ventura Group navigate a particularly difficult expansion 2 years earlier. A new hotel property that had run into zoning issues, construction delays, and a key investor pulling out at the last minute. Jordan had worked 80-hour weeks for 3 months straight, sleeping on his office couch some nights to help them find solutions. James had never forgotten it. And he never would. These 3 accounts alone represented nearly 40% of Jordan's team's revenue. They were the foundation on which much of his success had been built. They were relationships that had taken years to cultivate, not through manipulation or politics, but through simple reliability, through showing up, through keeping promises. And in the end, they would become the weapon that destroyed David Harrington. Not because Jordan wielded them as weapons, but because loyalty, once earned, cannot be stolen. But we're not there yet. First, let me tell you about David. If this story is hitting close to home, if you're already recognizing patterns from your own workplace, seeing echoes of bosses you've known or situations you've survived, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Share it with a coworker who might need to hear this, because the best defense against people like David Harrington is understanding how they operate. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it, and knowing what to look for might save your career someday. David Harrington arrived at Hartwell & Associates with a resume that sparkled and a reputation that, looking back with the clarity of hindsight, should have raised more questions than it did. He was 47 years old, tall, 6'2", with the kind of posture that came from years of consciously drawing himself up to full height. Silver-haired, with the distinguished temples of a movie star politician. He wore suits that cost more than some people's monthly rent, and watches that cost more than some people's cars. David was the kind of man who looked like he'd been designed by central casting to play successful executive in a corporate commercial. Everything about him conveyed authority and confidence, the firm handshake that lasted exactly the right number of seconds, the eye contact that never wavered, the voice that projected easily across any room. But there was something about that handshake that some people noticed. It was too firm. The kind of grip that seemed less like greeting and more like assertion, like he was establishing dominance in the first 3 seconds. And that eye contact, it wasn't quite connection. It was more like evaluation, like he was constantly calculating what you were worth and how you could be useful. On paper, David was exactly what the board was looking for to replace Patricia Chen. 15 years of management experience at well-known firms, a track record of what his resume called turnaround success, departments and teams he'd supposedly transformed from underperformers into stars, references from significant people, a presentation during the interview process that had impressed the executive committee, a confidence that suggested he knew exactly what the department needed and exactly how to provide it. What the board didn't know, because David was careful never to let them find out, was that his career was a carefully constructed facade. The truth was this: David Harrington had never actually built anything in his entire professional life. He was a political creature, a survivor, a man whose primary skill was positioning himself to claim credit for others' successes, while deflecting blame for any failures onto convenient scapegoats. At his previous company, a consulting firm in another city, David had been department head for 2 years. During that time, revenue for his department had increased by 12%, a number that featured prominently on his resume and in his interview presentations. What his resume didn't mention was that the increase had been driven almost entirely by 2 senior consultants who had left the company shortly before David did. They hadn't been fired, they'd quit. Tired, sources said, of having their work claimed by someone who rarely contributed anything substantive. Tired of writing reports that appeared with David's name at the top. Tired of watching him present their ideas to executives as if he'd thought of them himself. At the company before that, David had been restructured out of his position after a major project he'd championed failed spectacularly. A strategic initiative that had consumed millions of dollars and produced nothing of value. But he'd managed to negotiate a neutral reference and a quiet exit. The corporate equivalent of getting away with it. His pattern was always the same. Arrive with fanfare and big promises, delegate the actual work to competent subordinates who would do the heavy lifting. Take credit for every victory, often literally putting his name on work he hadn't done. Blame every failure on team members, market conditions, or factors beyond his control. And leave. Always leave. Before the full picture emerged, before people connected the dots, before the pattern became undeniable. The reasons behind David's behavior were complex, not excusable, but complex. I don't tell you this to make you sympathize with him, but I tell you because understanding what drives toxic people can help you recognize them earlier. And recognizing them earlier might save you from becoming their next victim. David grew up in a wealthy family in the suburbs of Meridian City, the kind of family that belonged to country clubs and donated to the right charities and appeared in the society pages of the local newspaper. His father was a prominent attorney who had made partner at a prestigious firm by 30 and retired early to manage the family investments. His mother sat on multiple charitable boards and organized galas that raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for causes she cared about. His older brother had graduated from Harvard Law and made partner at an even more prestigious firm by 33. His younger sister had become a successful surgeon, one of the youngest chiefs of surgery in her hospital's history. David had struggled. He wasn't stupid. He was intelligent enough, graduated from a respectable university with respectable grades, built a respectable career in a respectable field. But he wasn't brilliant. He wasn't exceptional. And in his family, intelligent enough meant failing to measure up. Every holiday dinner, every family gathering, every phone call with his parents, there were reminders. Sometimes subtle. Your brother just made the partner retreat committee. Sometimes less so. Have you thought about going back for another degree? It might open some doors. The weight of never being quite good enough pressed on David for years. It shaped him, warped him, made him desperate to appear successful, even if he couldn't actually achieve success. Somewhere along the way, probably gradually over many years, David had stopped trying to actually achieve and started trying to appear to achieve. The distinction mattered enormously. It became easier to take shortcuts, to claim others' work, to build an impressive-looking image rather than an impressive reality, to manage perceptions rather than outcomes. By the time he arrived at Hartwell and Associates at 47 years old, this approach wasn't even conscious strategy anymore. It was simply who he was. The mask had become the face. The performance had become the person. David's management style became apparent within his first month on the 14th floor. He scheduled meetings, team meetings every morning, individual check-ins twice a week, strategy sessions, status updates, planning meetings, review meetings. The calendar filled up like a dam overflowing. The effect, whether intended or not, was to consume an enormous amount of time that might otherwise have been spent doing actual work. Hours that consultants could have spent serving clients were instead spent in conference rooms, listening to David talk about strategic alignment and operational excellence, and other phrases that sounded important but meant nothing. He renamed things. Projects that had been running smoothly for years under Patricia Chen's leadership suddenly got new names, new frameworks, new strategic visions. The substance remained identical, the same people doing the same work for the same clients. But now, David could point to his initiatives when presenting to the executive committee. "I've implemented a new client engagement framework," he told the CEO 3 months in. The framework was Patricia's methodology with different labels. He cultivated relationships upward with almost religious devotion. Every executive at Hartwell received regular updates from David, carefully curated reports that highlighted departmental successes and minimized any problems. He had lunch with C-suite members at least twice a week. He played golf with board members on weekends. He attended every executive offsite and volunteered for every high-visibility committee. He was making himself indispensable to the people who could protect him, the people who signed off on bonuses and approved promotions, and crucially, would never see the daily reality of how he actually operated. And downward? Downward, David was a different person entirely. He could be charming when convenient, when someone could be useful to him, or when he needed buy-in for some initiative he wanted to claim later. He could flash warmth and humor when executives were watching, clapping team members on the back and praising their work in public forums. But in private, when utility was less clear, the mask slipped. He showed coldness to employees who challenged him or asked too many questions. He showed distance to people who weren't actively making him look good. And he showed outright hostility to anyone he perceived as a threat to his carefully constructed image. Jordan Mitchell, unfortunately, was perceived as exactly that kind of threat from almost the very beginning. The first clear sign of trouble came 3 months into David's tenure. Jordan had just completed a major project for Morrison Technologies, a comprehensive operational review that had taken his team 4 months and resulted in recommendations that would save the client an estimated $2 million annually. It was the kind of work that built reputations, the kind that got mentioned in industry publications and at client dinners and in annual reports. Robert Morrison was thrilled. He'd sent a personal note to Jordan, handwritten, on his company stationery, praising the thoroughness of the analysis and the practicality of the recommendations. He'd also, in conversations with Hartwell's CEO that Jordan wasn't supposed to know about, mentioned how impressed he was with the team's work. That mention traveled down the executive chain until it reached David Harrington's ears. And David, rather than being pleased that his department had scored a major win, felt something else entirely. A week later, David called Jordan into his office. The space still bore traces of Patricia Chen's tenure, the same mid-century modern furniture she'd selected, the same understated art on the walls, the same view of the city skyline through those floor-to-ceiling windows. But David had added his own touches. A set of expensive golf clubs leaned against one wall. Framed photos lined the credenza, showing David shaking hands with various important-looking people at various important-looking events. A Harvard Business Review award for an article he'd co-authored, though Jordan would later learn the co-author had done most of the actual writing, sat prominently on his desk. Jordan, great work on Morrison. David's smile was practiced, precise, the smile of someone who had learned to smile rather than someone who felt something worth smiling about. Really exceptional delivery. Thank you. The team worked incredibly hard. Jordan had learned early in his career to deflect praise toward the people who deserved it. Maria especially, she led the data analysis piece. "I've been thinking," David continued, leaning back in his leather chair with the casual posture of a man who owned the room, "about how we can leverage this success. I'm going to be presenting to the board next week on our departmental achievements. I'd like to include the Morrison Project as a case study of our new strategic approach. Jordan felt a small prick of unease. Something about the phrasing. Our new strategic approach felt off. The approach hadn't changed. Jordan's team had worked the same way they always had. Of course, would you like me to present? I can walk the board through the specifics. No. David's tone was smooth as silk. I'll handle the presentation. I know the board. I know how they like information delivered. Just send me your materials, slides, data, the whole package. You focus on the client work. I'll worry about the internal visibility. I'm really happy to help prepare the presentation itself. That won't be necessary. The silk had hardened, just for a moment, into something with an edge beneath it. Just send me what you have. I'll take care of the rest. Jordan sent the materials. A week later, he saw the presentation that David had given to the board. His team's work was there, slide for slide. The analysis, the recommendations, the implementation roadmap. But the language had been adjusted throughout. I identified an opportunity for operational improvement. My strategic framework drove the analysis. I personally oversaw the client relationship to ensure alignment with our departmental vision. Jordan's name appeared nowhere in the 37-page document. Neither did Maria's. Neither did anyone else's from the team that had actually done the work. That was the first time, but it was far from the last. Over the following months, a pattern emerged that became impossible to ignore. Every significant success from Jordan's team was reframed as David's initiative. Every presentation to leadership featured David's name prominently and the actual workers' names hardly at all. In meetings with clients, David would insert himself into conversations, asking questions designed to make him appear knowledgeable about work he'd never participated in. And when things went wrong, the pattern reversed with perfect precision. A project for a smaller client, Thornton Supplies, a mid-sized distributor, ran into problems midway through. Delays caused by a technology vendor who failed to deliver promised software on time. The vendor's failure cascaded through the project timeline, pushing deadlines back by weeks. It was entirely outside Jordan's control. He documented his concerns about the vendor in multiple emails. He'd flagged the risk during planning meetings. He'd even escalated to David directly, asking for help negotiating with the vendor or finding an alternative. David had done nothing. Had, in fact, dismissed Jordan's concerns as worry that isn't productive. And then, when the project finally delivered late and the client expressed frustration, David suddenly appeared in the crisis meetings. The same meetings he'd skipped throughout the project's troubled execution. The same client relationship he'd ignored until something went wrong. I've been concerned about the direction of this account, David told the Thornton executive, conveniently in front of Jordan and two of the client's senior staff. I think we need to reevaluate the team's approach. There have been some warning signs I've been tracking. The message was unmistakable. When things succeeded, David took credit. When things failed, someone else. Preferably someone like Jordan, who was too professional to throw his boss under the bus publicly. Took the blame. Jordan wasn't the only one who noticed. He's setting you up, Catherine Reyes told Jordan over coffee in the break room. It was 6 months into David's tenure. Late October. The autumn sun slanted through the windows at a low angle, casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, the leaves on the street trees had turned gold and red, a stark contrast to the gray tension inside the 14th floor. Catherine spoke quietly, nearly a whisper, despite the noise of the espresso machine providing cover. I've seen this before, at my last company, before Hartwell. Same pattern, same type of guy. "What do you mean?" Jordan asked, though a part of him, the part that had been watching the pattern emerge for months, already knew. "Guys like David." Catherine leaned closer, her brown eyes intense. "They can only take credit for so long before people start wondering what exactly they actually do. The executives might not see it, but the people doing the work? They know. And eventually, even executives start asking questions. So, what happens? When that moment comes, when scrutiny lands on him, he needs someone to blame. A scapegoat. Someone he can point to and say, "The problem was this person, and I fixed it by removing them." It saves his image without requiring him to actually change anything. Jordan was quiet for a long moment. "You think that's me?" "I think you're smart, successful, and well-liked by clients. Clients, as far as he's concerned." Catherine took a sip of her coffee. "You're too competent, too visible, too good at your job. That makes you a threat. Not to the company, but to him." "What do I do?" "Document everything." Catherine's voice dropped even lower. "Every email, every conversation that matters. Every piece of work you do and when you did it. Keep copies off-site, personal cloud, whatever. Build a paper trail proving what's actually happening. You might need it." Jordan nodded, but part of him still resisted. He'd worked at Hartwell for 7 years. He'd built his career on doing good work and trusting that the system would recognize it. He'd watched Patricia Chen rise to VP precisely because she was excellent at her job. Surely leadership would see through David eventually. Surely competence would win over politics. Surely merit still mattered. That was the first time Catherine warned him. It wouldn't be the last. And eventually, Jordan would learn, painfully, just how right she had been. If this is resonating with you, if you're recognizing your own workplace in these patterns, seeing yourself in Jordan's position, or recognizing a David in your own office, I need you to hear something important. You are not crazy. You are not overreacting. When something feels wrong, it usually is. Trust yourself. Trust your instincts. And please, like this video. Share it with everyone you know who might be going through something similar. Subscribe if you haven't already. Because what happens next is what happens when we don't listen to those warnings. And it's also what happens when karma finally catches up. Stay with me. The worst is still coming, but so is the justice. The escalation continued slowly, like water rising in a basement during a storm. You don't notice the flood until you're standing in it. 8 months into David's tenure, Jordan was called into a meeting with David and Sheila from HR. The meeting was described in the calendar invitation as a performance calibration session. Routine, David's assistant had assured Jordan when he'd asked. Nothing to worry about. But Jordan worried anyway. He'd learned by now to worry about anything that involved David and a closed door. Sheila was a woman in her 50s who'd been with Hartwell's HR department for almost 20 years. She had a round, pleasant face and glasses that she was constantly pushing up her nose. Jordan had always thought of her as one of the good ones, fair, professional, genuinely concerned with employee well-being. But sitting next to David in his office, notepad open on her lap, Sheila's expression was carefully neutral. Too neutral. The neutrality of someone preparing to document something. David was smiling, that practiced political smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Jordan, thanks for coming in. Please, sit." Jordan sat in the chair across the desk, the same chair where he'd sat 100 times before, for meetings with Patricia Chen that had felt collaborative and productive. Now the chair felt like the defendant's seat. "As you know," David began, steepling his fingers in a gesture he'd probably seen in a leadership training video. "I like to check in with all my senior people periodically, Get a sense of where they are, where they're growing, where they might benefit from development. Of course, Jordan kept his voice level, calm, professional. I've been reviewing your work over the past several months, and I have some concerns I wanted to share. David slid a printed document across the desk. Jordan picked it up, scanning the bullet points with a growing sense of surreal disbelief. The language was carefully crafted, vague enough to be difficult to refute, specific enough to sound credible to anyone who didn't know the full context. Client communication issues. Jordan silently reviewed his client relationships. He'd received nothing but praise from his clients for years. Robert Morrison had just sent a gift basket to the office, but David had attached a single email from a minor contact at a smaller account. Thornton Supplies, the same account that had suffered from the vendor delays David himself had ignored. The email expressed frustration about a delayed deliverable. Team leadership inconsistencies. Jordan's team had the highest satisfaction scores in the department. Every associate who'd worked for him had been promoted or moved on to excellent opportunities elsewhere. But David cited a complaint from a junior employee who had left the company months ago. An employee Jordan had counseled out due to performance issues. An employee who had blamed Jordan for accurately documenting her failures. Strategic misalignment with departmental goals. This one was especially infuriating. Jordan had exceeded every metric David had set: client retention, revenue generation, billable hours, everything that could be measured. But David was now redefining the goals retroactively, claiming that Jordan should have prioritized different initiatives that hadn't existed when the quarter began. Jordan looked up from the document. Sheila was taking notes. David was watching with that patient, sympathetic expression, the face of a concerned manager who truly wished things were different. "I'd like to respond to each of these points," Jordan said, keeping his voice steady through sheer force of will. "Of course." For the next 30 minutes, Jordan dismantled each accusation methodically. He had the receipts, he had the emails, he had the metrics. Every claim David had made could be directly contradicted by documented evidence. David listened, nodding occasionally, making sympathetic sounds. Sheila wrote in her notebook. The clock ticked on the wall. When Jordan finished, David leaned back and smiled again. "I appreciate you sharing your perspective. These are exactly the kinds of conversations we need to be having." He paused. "I'm not saying there's a problem, Jordan. I'm saying I want to support your growth. Consider this a development opportunity. Let's work together over the next few months and see if we can get things back on track." Development opportunity. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. Jordan had been in corporate America long enough to know what that phrase really meant. It was the first stage of a documentation process, the first step in building a paper trail that would justify removing someone, the beginning of the end. Walking out of that meeting, Jordan felt the ground shifting beneath him. He wasn't stupid. He could read the signals. Catherine's warnings echoed in his memory. The only question now was what he would do about it. That night, after Sophie had been tucked into bed with her favorite stuffed elephant and Amelia was reading in the next room, Jordan sat at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the main road. The kitchen light cast warm yellow across the maple table where the family had eaten dinner a few hours earlier. The remains of Sophie's macaroni and cheese were still crusted on one of the plates in the sink. Jordan stared at his laptop screen, flipping through files, emails, documentation. Everything he'd accomplished, every project delivered, every client saved, every problem solved. 7 years of his life crystallized in digital form. He thought about his father, Marcus, Working at that manufacturing plant for 32 years, showing up every day, doing the right thing, trusting that integrity would be rewarded, it wasn't always enough. Jordan was beginning to understand that now. The world didn't always reward goodness. Sometimes the bad guys won. Sometimes the liars and the politicers climbed higher than the honest people ever could. But sometimes if you were smart, you could fight back. Jordan started building his file. Every email that documented his contributions, every project report with his name on the actual work product, every performance review from before David's arrival showing consistent excellence, every communication with clients expressing satisfaction. He created a timeline of events. Every incident where David had taken credit, every meeting where blame had been deflected, every manipulation documented with dates and names. He saved copies to his personal cloud, printed hard copies and put them in a folder at home, backed up his backups. He didn't know yet exactly how he would use this evidence, but he knew, with a cold certainty that had been crystallizing for months, that he would need it. The battle was coming. Jordan intended to be armed. But even as he prepared for war, a traitorous part of Jordan still hoped. Maybe David would self-destruct on his own. Maybe the executives would finally see through him. Maybe everything Catherine had warned about wouldn't actually happen. Maybe, despite everything, the system would still work. Those hopes died on a Tuesday morning in March, under fluorescent lights, in an 8-minute meeting that would change Jordan's life forever. The firing happened without warning. The previous week had been normal, or what passed for normal under David's reign. Jordan had attended his meetings, coordinated with his team, delivered the work that had made him successful for 7 years. He'd been careful, professional, documenting everything as Catherine had advised. If anything, things had seemed unusual. David had been less present, less micromanaging, less overtly hostile. Jordan had almost started to hope, against his better judgment, that the storm might pass. He should have known better. The calm before the storm isn't peace, it's preparation. Tuesday morning, March 14th, Jordan arrived at the office at 7:15 a.m. as usual. He liked the early hours, before the floor filled up, when he could drink his coffee in peace and organize his thoughts for the day without interruption. The 14th floor was quiet. A few early birds at their desks, headphones on, focused on their own work. The coffee maker gurgling in the kitchen, the city visible through the windows, Meridian City coming to life as the sun rose higher over the financial district. Jordan spent 45 minutes reviewing emails and preparing for a 10 a.m. call with Robert Morrison. They were discussing a possible expansion project, new territory for Morrison Technologies, new opportunity for Hartwell. Jordan had been working on the proposal for weeks. At 9:17 a.m., a calendar invitation appeared on his screen. David Harrington, 10 a.m., David's office. No subject, no agenda. Jordan's stomach dropped. That cold feeling, the particular dread that comes when you know something is wrong but can't yet name it, spread through his chest like ice water. He sat at his desk for the next 43 minutes, unable to focus on anything else. The proposal he'd been refining sat open on his screen, the cursor blinking, but he couldn't read the words. His hands had gone cold. His mind kept returning to Catherine's warnings, to the development meeting months earlier, to every small sign he'd tried to explain away. At 9:50, he stood up and walked toward David's corner office. The floor seemed to stretch longer than usual. His colleagues glanced up as he passed, some with curiosity, others with expressions that looked uncomfortably like sympathy. Did they know? Had word already spread? In offices like this, Bad news traveled faster than light. David's office door was open. Inside, David sat behind his mahogany desk, wearing a navy suit and a concerned expression that looked rehearsed. Beside him sat Sheila from HR, her notepad already open, her face carefully neutral. A folder was placed on the empty chair across from them. Jordan didn't need to see what was in that folder. He already knew. "Jordan." David's voice was gentle, compassionate, completely fake. "Come in, close the door." The door clicked shut behind him. The office felt smaller than it ever had. The city stretched out beyond those floor-to-ceiling windows, indifferent to what was happening inside. Jordan sat. The next 8 minutes would replay in Jordan's mind for months afterward. Every word, every carefully chosen phrase, every pause that felt like a knife. David's explanation was brief and expertly worded. Restructuring, strategic realignment, different direction. The same corporate euphemisms used 1,000 times a day to disguise 1,000 different varieties of injustice. The words meant nothing. They were designed to mean nothing, to create plausible deniability, legal protection, a paper trail that would hold up under scrutiny. "We've decided to eliminate your position," David said. The word hung in the air like a sentence, as if Jordan were a line item on a budget spreadsheet, as if 7 years of dedication, 7 years of excellence, 7 years of client relationships and team building and problem solving could be erased with a single bureaucratic verb. "Sheila has prepared the details of your separation package." Jordan looked at Sheila. Her face was professionally neutral, but he saw something in her eyes. Discomfort, perhaps, maybe even guilt. She'd been with Hartwell long enough to know what was happening here, to know this wasn't restructuring. She slid the folder toward him. "Standard severance," she said quietly, not quite meeting his eyes. 12 weeks pay, COBRA information for continuing your health insurance, outplacement services if you'd like them. Jordan didn't touch the folder. He looked at David. "I'd like to understand the reasoning," he said. His voice was steady, steadier than he felt, steadier than his racing heart should have allowed. "My performance metrics are the highest in the department. My client retention is above 90%. My team satisfaction scores are the best on the floor. Which specific performance issues are driving this decision?" David's expression flickered, the briefest crack in the mask. Then the smooth politician returned. "This isn't about performance," he said. "It's about fit, about strategic direction. The department is evolving, and we need people who are aligned with our new vision. Sometimes that means making difficult decisions about team composition." "Is this about Morrison?" Jordan asked. "The project I just completed? The one you presented to the board under your name?" Something shifted in David's eyes. Recognition, calculation, the realization that Jordan wasn't going to play the role of confused, defeated employee. "I don't know what you're implying," David said carefully, "but this decision has been reviewed and approved at multiple levels. It's final." Jordan felt the words rising, the accusations, the evidence, the documented proof of every manipulation and theft of credit. Part of him was screaming to say it all, to burn this bridge so thoroughly that the flames could be seen from space, to make David understand, finally, that Jordan knew exactly what he was and exactly what he had done. But another part, the part that had documented everything, the part that had learned from Catherine, the part that still thought strategically even in this moment of crisis. Counseled patience. Don't show your hand. Not yet. "Is there anything else I should know before I leave?" Jordan asked. The question was mild, almost pleasant. David misread it completely. He smiled, that practiced political smile, and said, "Just know that this isn't personal, Jordan. It's business. I wish you the best in your future endeavors." Jordan stood. He didn't shake hands. He didn't thank anyone. He didn't say the things a more desperate person might say. The pleading, the bargaining, the attempts to change the outcome. He simply walked out of the office and toward his desk, already knowing that security would be there within minutes to escort him from the building. The walk through the floor was the longest of his life. Colleagues at their desks, looking up as he passed, some confused, they hadn't heard yet, some sympathetic, they had. Maria Santos, his senior analyst, his trusted colleague, stared at him with eyes wet with tears and a jaw clenched with barely contained fury. She couldn't say anything, not with HR watching, not with David observing from his office doorway, making sure the removal was complete. A security guard was already waiting by Jordan's desk, a young guy in a blazer who looked uncomfortable with his assignment. A cardboard box sat on Jordan's chair. Jordan packed methodically. His mind had gone strangely calm. The shock was there, he knew, waiting to crash over him later. But for now, he moved on autopilot. Family photos first. Amelia and Sophie at the beach last summer, squinting in the sunshine, covered in sand and perfectly happy. His daughter's gap-toothed grin, preserved in a silver frame. Then his coffee mug, the one Sophie had painted for Father's Day, with blue fingerprints pressed into the clay and "Best Dad" written in wobbly letters. His notebook, the thank you cards from clients that he'd kept in a drawer because they mattered, because they represented relationships that meant something. He left the awards on the wall, left the company laptop, left the ergonomic keyboard and the 3 computer monitors and the office supplies he'd accumulated over 7 years. He left everything that belonged to Hartwell and Associates, because none of it had ever really been his. Maria appeared at his desk as he finished packing. Her face was pale, her hands were shaking. "Jordan," her voice cracked on his name. "I'm so sorry. This is insane. Everyone knows this is wrong." "I know," he managed a small smile for her. "It'll be okay." "What are you going to do?" Jordan hefted the box onto his hip. He looked around the floor one last time, at the desks where he'd worked, at the conference rooms where he'd celebrated victories and navigated crises, at the window that showed the skyline of Meridian City stretching toward the horizon, still indifferent, still beautiful, still turning regardless of what happened to people like him. "I'm going to go home," he said quietly. "I'm going to hug my daughter. I'm going to tell my wife what happened. And then I'm going to figure out what comes next." Security walked him to the elevator. The young guard kept his eyes forward, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Through the glass walls of his office, Jordan could see David, already on the phone, already positioning, already spinning whatever story would protect him from examination, already confident that he'd gotten away with it. The elevator doors opened. Jordan stepped inside, and just before the doors closed, he saw David glance up from his call and smile. That smile changed everything. In that moment, watching David's self-satisfied, triumphant expression through the narrowing gap of the elevator doors, something crystallized in Jordan's mind with absolute clarity. This wasn't just about being fired. This was about justice. This was about a man who had systematically stolen credit, manipulated evidence, and destroyed careers. A man who had probably done this before and would certainly do it again. A man who fully expected to get away with it because he always had. Jordan wasn't going to let him. The elevator descended. The numbers ticked down, and by the time the doors opened on the ground floor, Jordan Mitchell had made up his mind. He wasn't going to sue. Lawsuits took years, drained savings, consumed mental energy that could be spent building something better. He wasn't going to rage. Rage felt good for a moment and changed nothing. He was going to do something far more devastating. He was going to succeed. Visibly, undeniably, spectacularly. He was going to build his career back stronger than before, and he was going to let David Harrington watch. Because the best revenge wasn't destruction. The best revenge was rising. The first 3 weeks after the firing were brutal. Jordan drove home that Tuesday morning in a daze. He sat in the driveway of his house for 20 minutes before going inside, trying to figure out how to tell Amelia. Trying to figure out how to explain that everything they'd built together, the stability, the security, the plans for Sophie's future, was suddenly uncertain. The engine ticked as it cooled. A bird sang somewhere in the trees. The morning continued as if nothing had happened. He walked through the front door at 11 a.m. when Amelia was still at work and Sophie was at school. The house was empty and quiet. He set the cardboard box on the kitchen table and stared at it without really seeing it. Then he sat down on the kitchen floor, his back against the cabinets, and he cried. Not for long. He'd never been someone who indulged in extended grief. But for 15 minutes, alone in the house where his family lived, Jordan let himself feel the enormity of what had happened. 7 years of work, gone. His professional identity, shattered. His sense of security, destroyed. Everything he'd believed about hard work and fairness and merit, all of it called into question by a smiling man in a corner office who'd never done an honest day's work in his life. He pulled himself together by the time Sophie came home from school, put on a normal face, asked about her day, helped her with her snack. He didn't mention anything was wrong. How do you explain corporate betrayal to a 6-year-old? But Sophie was perceptive, even at her age. "Daddy, why are you home?" she asked, swinging her legs at the kitchen table while she ate her apple slices. "Daddy's taking some time off work," he said. "Sometimes grown-ups need breaks too." She studied him with those big brown eyes, her mother's eyes. "Are you sad?" He sat down next to her. "A little bit, sweetie, but I'll be okay." "When I'm sad," Sophie said seriously, "I hug my elephant and I feel better." She ran to her room and came back with her stuffed elephant, thrusting it toward him. "You can borrow him." Jordan took the elephant, and he hugged his daughter, and he hugged the stuffed elephant, and he felt something shift inside him. He had things worth fighting for. He wasn't going to give up. Telling Amelia was harder. She came home at 6:30, tired from a long day of patient sessions, and found Jordan making dinner. Her job, usually, but he'd needed something to do with his hands. She knew immediately something was wrong. The way she froze in the kitchen doorway, still holding her bag, reading his face. "Jordan, what happened?" He turned off the stove, set down the spatula, took a breath. "They let me go," he said. "David, this morning." For a moment, Amelia just stared at him, processing. Then the questions came. What happened? Why? What did they say? What are you going to do? And he answered them as best he could, and then she did exactly what he needed. She walked across the kitchen, put her arms around him, and held him. "We'll figure this out," she said into his shoulder. "We have savings. We have each other. We'll figure this out." The nights were hard. Jordan lay awake in the darkness replaying conversations. What if he'd said something different in that final meeting? What if he'd confronted David earlier, when the pattern first emerged? What if he'd documented even more, or talked to HR himself, or somehow outsmarted David's manipulation before it was too late? The anger came in waves, sometimes cold and focused, the kind of anger that could power productive action. Sometimes hot and overwhelming, rage that made his jaw tight and his fists clench and his whole body feel like a weapon with no target. And underneath the anger, always, was fear. What if he couldn't find another job? What if David had already poisoned his reputation, making calls to connections, spreading stories about performance issues? What if no one would hire a consultant who'd been pushed out of his previous firm? What if this was the end of everything? There were moments in those first weeks when Jordan came close to giving up. One night, it must have been the end of week 2. He found himself at the kitchen table at 2 a.m., staring at job listings without really reading them. The house was dark and silent. His coffee had gone cold hours ago. He'd sent out 30 applications. He'd heard back from 2. Form rejections that arrived within hours. What's the point? The thought was insidious, crawling. David wins. That's how it works. People like him always win. He was on the edge of despair, the edge of giving up and settling for whatever he could get, the edge of accepting that the system was rigged and he was just one more victim. And then he looked up and saw Sophie's painting on the refrigerator. It was a crayon picture she'd made at school, a house with a tree next to it, 4 stick figures in front, 2 tall, 1 medium, 1 small. "My family," written at the top in purple letters. Jordan stared at that picture for a long time. He thought about his father, Marcus, 32 years at the same plant, showing up every day whether he felt like it or not. He thought about his mother, Evelyn, teaching the same concepts over and over until every student understood. He thought about Sophie's face when she'd offered him her stuffed elephant, the absolute confidence that the elephant would help, that things would get better. And something shifted. He wasn't going to let David Harrington take this from him. Not his career, not his confidence, not his sense of what was fair and true. Jordan opened his laptop and started a new document. At the top, he typed, "Strategy," and he began to plan. The old saying goes, "The best revenge is living well." But Jordan was about to learn that there was a better revenge still. The best revenge was building something so good, so undeniable, so impossible to ignore, that the people who had wronged you had to watch you succeed while their own world crumbled. Jordan's strategy had 3 parts. Part 1, stay visible and professional. He updated his LinkedIn profile carefully, mentioning that he was exploring new opportunities without any hint of bitterness or drama. He reached out to former colleagues and industry contacts, not to complain about David, but simply to reconnect. He attended networking events and presented himself as exactly what he was, an experienced professional with a track record of results. He never badmouthed Hartwell, never mentioned David by name, never appeared bitter or defeated. Within a month, he had lunch meetings scheduled with 3 competitors who tried to recruit him over the years. Within 6 weeks, he had offers from 2 of them. He chose Canterbury and Partners carefully. They were slightly larger than Hartwell, with a stronger reputation and better resources. The team culture seemed healthy, no David Harringtons in sight. And critically, they were willing to give him significant autonomy over business development. The role was senior consultant, same as before, but with a clear path to director within 2 years. Better salary, better benefits, better prospects. Jordan accepted the offer on a Wednesday morning in May, exactly 8 weeks after being escorted from the Hartwell building. Part 2. Protect and maintain relationships. Within the bounds of his non-compete agreement, Jordan reached out to his former clients. Not to poach them. That would be unethical and potentially illegal. Just to maintain the relationships. To let them know he'd moved on. To thank them for the partnership over the years. To leave a door open without pushing anyone through it. Robert Morrison called him back within an hour. "Jordan, I was wondering when I'd hear from you." "Robert, I wanted to thank you for everything. Working with Morrison Technologies has been a highlight of my career." A pause on the line. Then, "David Harrington called me last week. Said you'd transitioned to new opportunities." Morrison's tone was dry. "That's quite a euphemism." Jordan didn't offer details. "I'm focusing on what's ahead." "Canterbury, right? Good firm." Another pause. "Listen, Jordan, I've been working with Hartwell for a long time, but I work with Hartwell because of the people, and the person I trusted most just transitioned." Jordan said nothing. He didn't need to. "Give me 6 months," Morrison said. "Let things settle. Let me see how Hartwell handles things, and then we should talk." Similar conversations happened with Margaret Whitfield and James Ventura. Neither made promises. Both made it clear that their loyalty wasn't to a company logo. It was to the person who had earned their trust. Jordan didn't ask them to leave Hartwell. He didn't lobby or campaign. He simply reminded them, through his professionalism and grace, that he was still the person they'd worked with for years. And then he waited. Part 3. Document and wait. Jordan kept his files organized, the evidence of David's behavior, the timeline of manipulations, the proof, if he ever needed it, of what had actually happened at Hartwell and Associates. But he didn't act on it. Not yet. He trusted, he had to trust, that David would make a mistake, that the pattern would continue, that eventually the executives who'd been charmed would start asking questions they should have asked months ago. Please take a second to subscribe if you haven't already. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this, because what happens next is karma in action. Back at Hartwell and Associates, things were not going well. Jordan heard about it through the grapevine, industry contacts, former colleagues who still trusted him, and Maria Santos, who called him on a burner phone she'd bought specifically to avoid any appearance of company disloyalty. That's how loyal she was. "You need to know what's happening," Maria said one evening, 3 months after Jordan's departure. It was early summer. The trees outside Jordan's window had turned green. Life was continuing, as life does. "Tell me." The first sign of trouble at Hartwell was the Whitfield account. 3 months after Jordan's departure, Margaret Whitfield requested a meeting with David to discuss concerns about service quality. This wasn't a casual check-in. Margaret Whitfield didn't do casual. She was scheduling a formal conversation because something had gone wrong. The consultant assigned to replace Jordan on the Whitfield account was competent enough on paper. Good education, reasonable experience, impressive interview. But he didn't know Margaret. He didn't understand that Margaret valued precision above everything else. He didn't know that she expected responses to emails within 4 hours, that she needed detailed status reports every Friday, that she had no patience for jargon or corporate speak. He sent her a status report full of bullet points and buzzwords. She asked for clarification on 3 items. He sent a reply that was somehow even more vague than the original. She requested a meeting. David, of course, had been paying no attention to the actual work being done. He'd been busy managing up, golfing with board members, preparing presentations about initiatives that existed only on paper. The day-to-day of client service? That was other people's problem, until it became his problem. David walked into the meeting with Margaret Whitfield, unprepared and overconfident. He assumed, because he always assumed, that his charm would carry him through, that he could smooth talk his way past any concern. Margaret Whitfield was not someone who could be smooth-talked. Maria told Jordan what happened, piecing it together from multiple sources who'd been in the room or heard about it afterward. She asked him direct questions about the project timeline, Maria said. Specific questions, technical questions, and he couldn't answer a single one. He kept trying to redirect to bigger picture strategy. You know the type. Jordan knew the type. He'd lived under that type for 18 months. Margaret looked at him for about 30 seconds, just looked. And then she said, "Mr. Harrington, I've worked with Hartwell for 3 years because Jordan Mitchell made me trust him. Jordan is gone. And now you're telling me you don't know the details of my account? I want you to understand that if things don't improve immediately, I'll be looking at alternatives." Maria paused. His face was priceless. The second sign was the Morrison Technologies expansion project. David, in a rare moment of actually attending to departmental business, had promised Robert Morrison a comprehensive strategic review. New markets, new product lines, a full-scale analysis of where Morrison Technologies could expand in the next 5 years. It was exactly the kind of project Jordan had been preparing before his termination. The kind of work that required deep understanding of the client, careful research, and months of preparation. David promised it in 90 days. Because 90 days sounded good. Because David never considered whether his promises could actually be kept. The deadline came and went. The review that was finally delivered 2 weeks late was incomplete, rushed, and full of errors. Obvious errors, the kind that anyone who actually knew Morrison Technologies would have caught immediately. One section referred to the wrong year's revenue numbers. Another cited competitors who had gone out of business. The strategic recommendations were generic to the point of uselessness. Boilerplate advice that could have applied to any software company in any market. Robert Morrison read the report. He read it carefully because Robert was someone who paid attention to details. And then he sent a quiet email to David expressing his disappointment. Disappointment from Robert Morrison was the equivalent of a door slamming shut. Robert didn't express disappointment lightly. Robert kept his opinions to himself until he was absolutely certain of them. David, characteristically, blamed the team that had prepared the report. Never mind that he hadn't reviewed it himself. Never mind that he'd promised a timeline that was impossible to meet. Never mind that he didn't understand the client well enough to even recognize the errors. The team was at fault. David was blameless. And then there was the Ventura Group. James Ventura was not a patient man. He was also not a quiet man. When things went wrong, everyone in a 3-block radius knew about it. The team David had assigned to the Ventura Group was struggling. The Ventura account required a certain type of energy, a willingness to match James's intensity, to work odd hours when he had ideas at 11 p.m., to attend events and openings and understand the hospitality business from the inside. The consultant David assigned was an introvert who preferred spreadsheets to people. A good analyst, but completely wrong for James Ventura. Within 2 months, deliverables were late, communications were missed, and James was growing frustrated. When a critical tax deadline was almost missed because of a scheduling error on the consulting team's side, James exploded. He called David directly. And according to Maria's sources, multiple sources, all reporting the same basic facts, he, quote, tore him a new one. The language was colorful, Maria said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. Very colorful, very loud. The entire floor could hear it through the phone. From David's office, with the door closed. The dominoes were starting to wobble. Jordan received these updates with mixed emotions. Part of him felt vindicated. Every failure at Hartwell, every crack in David's carefully constructed image, was confirmation of what Jordan had known all along, that David was a fraud, that his success was built on theft and manipulation, that eventually, without someone competent to steal from, the facade would crumble. But another part of Jordan felt nothing. He wasn't celebrating, he wasn't gloating. He was building his own life, his own career, his own future, and what happened at Hartwell was becoming less relevant by the day. He had a new job, good colleagues, clients who appreciated him. Revenge was no longer the point. Success was the point. But he kept listening, because he knew, with a quiet certainty, that the final chapter hadn't been written yet. The first client defected in September, 6 months exactly after Jordan's firing. Morrison Technologies formally terminated their contract with Hartwell and Associates. The letter was brief, formal, and devastating. It cited declining service quality and lack of alignment with our organizational needs. There was no mention of David Harrington by name. There didn't need to be. Robert Morrison's new consulting partner? Canterbury and Partners. The account was assigned to their senior consultant with the strongest track record in the technology sector. That consultant was Jordan Mitchell. David Harrington convened an emergency meeting when the Morrison termination came through. "We need to discuss client retention strategies," he announced to the department, his face carefully composed, even as deals unraveled around him. "I've identified some systemic issues in our service delivery that we need to address." Systemic issues. Not his issues, systemic ones. Impersonal, nobody's fault. Just systems that needed fixing. He tried to blame the loss on the team that had managed the account after Jordan's departure. Claimed they hadn't executed his vision properly. Claimed that if they had followed his strategic framework, the client would still be satisfied. But the executives were starting to ask questions. Pointed questions. Questions about David specifically. Questions about why 3 major accounts were all struggling at the same time. Questions about what had changed on the 14th floor since Patricia Chen's departure. David deflected expertly. He'd been deflecting his entire career, but the questions didn't stop. The second client followed in October. Margaret Whitfield sent a carefully worded letter, as carefully worded as everything Margaret did. Whitfield Manufacturing would be seeking new consulting partners who better align with our organizational culture and quality expectations. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. By Friday, Whitfield Manufacturing was in preliminary discussions with Canterbury and Partners. The third client, the Ventura Group, didn't bother with careful wording or formal letters. James Ventura called David directly one final time. This time, the call was shorter, but even more emphatic. He told David in expansive and profane detail exactly what he thought of the service he'd received over the past 6 months. He told David that he'd tolerated incompetence for exactly long enough. He told David that if Hartwell didn't let them out of their contract immediately, he would spend the next year telling everyone he knew in the hospitality industry what working with Hartwell was really like. The call lasted 12 minutes. By the end, Ventura had threatened to sue, threatened to file complaints, and threatened to write a very detailed review on every business platform he could find. David let them out of the contract. 6 months after Jordan's departure, Hartwell & Associates' client services department had lost 3 of its largest accounts. Revenue had dropped by nearly 40%. The team was in chaos. Morale had collapsed. 2 senior consultants had already submitted their resignations, citing changes in departmental culture. And the executives who had once praised David's strategic leadership and innovative frameworks were now demanding explanations that David couldn't provide. The investigation began in late October. It started quietly. A request from Patricia Chen, now VP of Operations, to review some account files from the Client Services Department. Just a routine check, she told David. Nothing to worry about. But Patricia Chen didn't do routine checks. Patricia Chen had built her career on paying attention to details. The investigators she assigned started by reviewing account files, communications, and project documentation. They pulled records from the past 18 months. They compared promised timelines to actual delivery. They cross-referenced David's claims in board presentations with actual project outcomes. And they found things. Not just incompetence, not just mismanagement, actual falsification. David had been manipulating data in his reports to the board, inflating project success metrics, taking client satisfaction scores from before his tenure and presenting them as current results, claiming credit for work documented as having been completed by other team members, sometimes by team members who'd been terminated. But the most damning discovery was a performance review document. It was dated 3 months before Jordan's termination, and it purported to show that Jordan Mitchell had been flagged for significant performance concerns long before the actual confrontation occurred. The document was a fabrication. When investigators compared it to system records showing when files were actually created and modified, they found that the document had been generated 12 days after Jordan's termination and then backdated. A clumsy attempt to create a paper trail that hadn't existed, evidence of a predetermined conclusion. The discovery was damning. This wasn't just evidence of poor management or political maneuvering. This was evidence of document falsification, evidence of fraud, evidence of a systematic effort to destroy someone's career based on lies. Patricia Chen read the investigation report in her corner office. Then she read it again. Then she called an emergency meeting with the CEO and the head of HR. Maria called Jordan the night before the board meeting that would decide David's fate. It was late. November now. The trees outside were bare. Winter was coming. They found everything, Maria said. Her voice was quiet, awed almost. Everything he did, every lie, every manipulation. They found the backdated document, Jordan, the one about you, the one he created after you were gone. Jordan was silent for a long moment. How? Patricia, she never trusted David. When the accounts started falling apart, she started digging, and she found it all. Maria took a breath. Jordan, when you said you documented everything, I didn't realize. I kept records because someone told me to. A friend who'd seen this before. Catherine? Yeah, Catherine. Maria was silent for a moment, then, the board meeting is tomorrow at 9 a.m. By 10 o'clock, David Harrington will no longer be employed by Hartwell and Associates. Jordan hung up the phone. He stood at his living room window, looking out at the street where his daughter played, where his neighbors walked their dogs, where life continued as it always had. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel vindication. He felt something quieter, more complicated. Relief, perhaps. That justice was arriving. that the system, however slowly, was working. But also a kind of weariness, because none of this should have happened, because David should never have been hired, should never have been believed, should never have been given the power to destroy careers based on nothing but politics. Jordan had been lucky. He'd had savings. He'd had skills that were in demand. He'd had relationships that survived his termination. He'd landed on his feet. But what about the people who weren't that lucky? The ones who didn't have Catherine's warning, the ones who didn't document, the ones who were crushed by David's in 1,000 companies and never recovered. Jordan stood at the window for a long time, thinking about that. The firing happened exactly as Maria predicted. At 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in November, security escorted David Harrington from the same building where he had escorted Jordan 6 months earlier. The same 14th floor, the same elevator, the same cardboard box. But there was one significant difference. Jordan was there. Not by design, not as part of some calculated revenge scheme. He was at Hartwell that day for a legitimate business reason. Morrison Technologies, under Robert Morrison's guidance, was considering a hybrid consulting arrangement that would involve both Canterbury and Hartwell resources. It was a complicated deal. Canterbury would handle strategic planning. Hartwell would provide execution support in areas where they still had strong capabilities. Jordan was there to meet with Robert and 2 Hartwell executives to discuss how the partnership might work. The timing was pure coincidence. Or maybe it was karma, making sure its debts were collected where they could be witnessed. Jordan sat in the glass-walled conference room, reviewing presentation materials with Robert Morrison and 2 Hartwell executives who hadn't been tainted by David's tenure. Through the glass, he had a clear view of the floor, the same floor where he'd worked for 7 years. The same desks, the same coffee machine, the same window overlooking Meridian City's skyline, and he could see David's corner office. The security guards in the doorway, the cardboard box being filled with personal effects, the golf clubs being carefully packed, the framed photos being removed from the credenza. David's face was drawn and pale. The silver hair that had once seemed so distinguished now just looked gray. The confident posture had collapsed into something smaller, diminished. And then David looked up. Their eyes met through the glass. 2 men who had been on opposite sides of a power struggle that had destroyed careers and consumed years. The one who had all the authority, all the political skill, all the institutional protection, and the one who had all the competence, all the relationships, all the trust that actually mattered. David's face registered recognition, then something else. Not fear, not quite, but awareness. The awareness that Jordan had watched everything, that Jordan was still here, still succeeding, still building, while David was being marched out under supervision. The awareness that karma had come to collect. Jordan held David's gaze for 3 full seconds. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He didn't make any gesture or expression that could be interpreted as triumphalism. He simply looked. Long enough to convey a message. Long enough to let David understand, fully and completely, that the ledger had finally balanced. Then Jordan looked back down at his presentation materials. He had work to do. Real work. The kind that built things instead of destroying them. David finished packing his box. Security walked him to the elevator. The floor watched in silence. Some faces showed shock. Some showed confusion. Some, like Maria's, showed barely concealed satisfaction. The elevator doors opened. David stepped inside, clutching his box of personal effects like a life preserver. And just before the doors closed, Jordan saw something he'd never seen on David Harrington's face before. Shame. The doors closed, the elevator descended, and David Harrington disappeared from Hartwell and Associates forever. The aftermath played out over the following months. David struggled to find new employment. His termination was officially classified as restructuring, a corporate courtesy that Hartwell extended to avoid legal complications. But word traveled fast in the consulting industry. Within weeks, everyone who mattered knew the real reason. He tried to reinvent himself, changed his LinkedIn headline to Executive Consultant, Strategic Advisory, started posting thought leadership articles about topics he barely understood, reached out to contacts he'd cultivated over the years. But the offers weren't coming. The people he'd played golf with suddenly had scheduling conflicts. The executives he'd lunched with stopped returning calls. The industry that had once seemed so receptive to his particular brand of political charm had quietly closed its doors. Last Jordan heard, David had taken a position at a small firm no one had heard of, doing work far below his previous level. A humbling come-down for a man who had once occupied a corner office with a view. But Jordan didn't spend much time thinking about David. He had better things to focus on. The clients returned. Morrison Technologies became one of Canterbury & Partners' largest accounts, with Jordan leading a team that delivered the strategic expansion review David had promised and failed to provide. Robert Morrison signed a 3-year contract extension within 6 months. Margaret Whitfield signed with Canterbury as well. She still called Jordan Mr. Mitchell, still sent Christmas cards with handwritten notes, still expected responses within 4 hours. Some things never changed. Jordan wouldn't have wanted them to. James Ventura threw an actual party to celebrate his return to working with Jordan. A cocktail event at one of his hotels with champagne and appetizers and a toast that was exactly as loud and profane as anything else James did. "To Jordan Mitchell," James announced to the assembled guests, champagne glass raised high. "The only consultant who ever actually listened to what I was saying. And more importantly, the only one who ever told me when I was being an idiot." Jordan laughed. The room laughed. And somewhere, probably, David Harrington was updating his resume again. Jordan was promoted to director within a year of joining Canterbury & Partners. The career that David Harrington had tried to destroy was stronger than ever. The same skills that had made Jordan successful at Hartwell made him successful at Canterbury. The same relationships that David had tried to claim made Jordan irreplaceable in ways that had nothing to do with job titles or office politics. He'd built something real, and real things are hard to destroy. Back at Hartwell, changes were made. Patricia Chen personally oversaw the rebuilding of the Client Services Department. She promoted Maria Santos to senior consultant. She made sure Daniel Okafor, who had survived David's tenure with his ethics intact, received the mentorship he deserved. She created new systems to prevent anyone like David from gaining power without accountability again. And Catherine Reyes, the quiet ally who had warned Jordan when no one else would? She was finally recognized for the wisdom she'd always had. Patricia made her interim department head while they searched for a permanent replacement. "You've been watching this department's culture for years," Patricia told her. "Now I want you to help fix it." Catherine said yes. And Harry Brennan, the old mentor who'd taken Jordan under his wing when he was just starting out? Harry sent Jordan a handwritten note that Jordan still keeps in his desk drawer. "Told you this business was about trust," Harry wrote. "Everything else is just arithmetic. Proud of you, son." Jordan read that note 3 times. Then he put it in his desk and got back to work. And Jordan himself? Jordan went home to his wife and daughter. He took Sophie to the park on Saturday mornings and pushed her on the swings until his arms got tired. He helped Amelia fix the leaky faucet they'd been ignoring for months. He hosted barbecues for neighbors who'd become friends. He called his parents every Sunday and listened to his father talk about the garden. He built a life that was good, genuinely good. Not just successful, not just impressive, but actually good. The kind of life where you wake up in the morning and feel grateful for what you have. The anger faded eventually. Not all at once, not in some dramatic moment of forgiveness, but gradually, like a bruise healing, the sharp edges of Jordan's fury toward David Harrington softened into something that didn't hurt anymore. The fear faded too. The late-night terrors about David poisoning his reputation, about never working again, about ending up on the street. All of it receded as Jordan built his new career, one successful project at a time. What remained was something quieter. A sense that justice wasn't always dramatic courtroom speeches or smoking gun revelations. Sometimes justice was simply building something better than what had been destroyed. Sometimes justice was living well. Sometimes justice was becoming so undeniably excellent that the people who had tried to diminish you had to watch you shine. 6 months. That's how long it took for karma to collect what David Harrington owed. 6 months of patience from Jordan. 6 months of building instead of burning. 6 months of trusting that the truth would eventually surface. And it did surface. It always does, eventually. The ledger balances. The debts come due. Karma never forgets. And it never runs out of patience. So here's what I learned from watching this story unfold. These are the lessons that Jordan Mitchell's journey taught me, and I want to share them with you, because maybe, just maybe, they'll help someone who's in the middle of their own battle right now. First, everything. This is the most practical lesson Jordan learned, and it's the one that might save your career someday. Every significant project you work on, every contribution you make, every email that shows the reality of your performance versus what someone might claim later, every meeting where important decisions were made and who actually made them. Keep records. Save emails to your personal account when company policy allows. Take notes in meetings. Create a timeline of your accomplishments with dates and details. Not because you're paranoid, because you're prepared. Catherine Reyes gave Jordan this advice. Jordan followed it, and when the investigation came, years of documentation was there to prove exactly what had happened. You might never need your documentation. Most people won't, but the people who do need it and don't have it, they're the ones who get destroyed by the David Harringtons of the world. Be the person who has it, just in case. Second, relationships matter more than titles. David Harrington had the title. He had the corner office. He had the executive parking space and the mahogany desk and the power to fire people with a single meeting. But he didn't have the relationships that actually mattered. When Jordan left Hartwell, his clients followed him, not because he asked them to, not because he lobbied or campaigned or made dramatic gestures, because he'd spent years earning their trust, because he'd shown up consistently and delivered what he promised, because he'd remembered their children's names and asked about their challenges and treated them like human beings instead of revenue streams. David could fire Jordan, but he couldn't take those relationships away. They belonged to Jordan because Jordan had built them, one genuine interaction at a time. Invest in relationships. Be the person people want to work with, not because you're political or calculating, but because you actually care about the people around you. It's the best career insurance you can buy, and unlike titles and corner offices, no one can take it away from you. Third, the best revenge is success. Jordan could have sued David, could have spent years in litigation, draining his savings and his mental health on a battle that might not ever produce results. He could have gone public, could have written LinkedIn posts and industry articles exposing what David had done, could have made it his mission to destroy David's reputation as thoroughly as David had tried to destroy his. He could have raged, could have spent years mired in bitterness, replaying conversations, fantasizing about confrontations that would never happen. Instead, he focused on building something new. Every client Jordan won was his revenge. Every project he delivered successfully. Every colleague who trusted him, every executive who promoted him, every metric that proved his value. He didn't need to destroy David. He just needed to succeed so visibly, so undeniably, that everyone could see the truth for themselves. When someone wrongs you, the temptation is to attack. It feels righteous. It feels like justice. But attacking ties you to your enemy. It makes them the center of your story instead of you. Moving forward makes the center. Your success, your growth, your future. Let them watch you succeed. It hurts more than anything you could do to them directly, because every achievement of yours is evidence of their failure. Every win of yours is a reminder of what they tried to take away and couldn't. The best revenge isn't destruction. It's building something they can't touch. Fourth, toxic people destroy themselves. This might be the hardest lesson to believe when you're in the middle of it. When someone with power is using that power against you, it feels like they'll get away with it forever. It feels like the system is rigged, like the bad guys always win, like there's no point in being good because evil is more effective. But people like David Harrington can't help themselves. They keep taking credit for things they didn't do. They keep deflecting blame onto innocent people. They keep burning bridges with everyone who gets close enough to see the truth. Eventually, there are no bridges left. Eventually, the competent people they were stealing from leave. Eventually, the executives they were charming start asking questions. Eventually, the pattern becomes undeniable. You don't have to destroy them. You just have to get out of the blast radius and let them do the work themselves. David Harrington destroyed David Harrington. Jordan just got out of the way and let it happen. Be patient. Document everything. Build your own success. And trust that the pattern will eventually catch up with them. It always does. And fifth, the most important lesson of all, trust the ledger. The universe keeps score. I know that sounds mystical. I know it sounds like wishful thinking. I know that when you're in the middle of injustice, when you've been wronged, and the person who wronged you seems to be thriving, it's hard to believe that any cosmic accounting system actually exists. But it does. Every action has a consequence. Every choice reverberates outward. Every lie creates a vulnerability that might not be exploited today or tomorrow, but will eventually be found. The people who cheat, who steal, who manipulate, they always pay eventually. Maybe not immediately. Maybe not in the way you expect. Maybe not in a timeline that feels fair or satisfying. But the debt comes due. The ledger balances, karma collects. Trust the process. Focus on being the best version of yourself. Do good work, build real relationships, create genuine value, and let the ledger balance itself. Because it will. It always does. That's the story of how one man was fired for no reason and watched his boss lose everything. Jordan Mitchell didn't seek revenge. He sought success. He sought to build something better than what had been taken from him. He sought to prove, through action rather than accusation, that competence and integrity matter even when they seem not to. And karma, moving on its own schedule, in its own inscrutable way, made sure that the truth came out. It took 6 months. But karma remembered every detail. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with a toxic boss? Have you ever been forced out of a job unfairly? Have you ever watched someone like David Harrington finally get what was coming to them? Or are you in the middle of it right now? Stuck under someone who steals credit and deflects blame and seems untouchable? Tell me in the comments. Share your story, because I know Jordan Mitchell isn't alone in this. There are people watching right now who are in the middle of what he went through. People who are lying awake at night, wondering if they're crazy, wondering if they're the problem, wondering if there's any hope. They need to know that it gets better. They need to know that the ledger eventually balances. They need to know that they're not alone. So share your story. Help them see that they're part of a community of people who've been through this and come out the other side. If this story helped you, if it gave you hope when you needed it, or perspective when you were lost, or just reminded you that justice is possible even when it doesn't feel that way, please subscribe to Karma's Echo. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear it. A coworker who's struggling, a friend who's been mistreated, anyone who needs to be reminded that the good guys sometimes win. Because the more people who understand how this works, the more people who learn to document everything and build relationships and trust the process, the fewer victims people like David Harrington can create. And remember, always, the universe keeps perfect records. Every promise broken, every credit stolen, every career destroyed through manipulation. It's all written down in that ledger that karma keeps hidden from view. The ledger always balances. Sometimes it just takes a little time. This has been another chapter in the Book of Consequences. Stay wise, stay watching, stay patient, and until next time, watch your ledger.